the meeting. I see we have 45 participants. Um, so for all the participants out there, I don't see you, but I know you exist. You're very welcome. My name is David Farrell. I'm head of politics at UCD, and I'm chairing the panel that the Geary Institute has set up. I want to congratulate the Geary Institute on organising this particular series of workshops in the light of the COVID crisis. So there's going to be three speakers. I'll start, I'll do my spiel now, and then I will introduce each of the other two speakers in turn. We're going to speak for about 10 to 15 minutes each, and then that should allow plenty of time for Q&A afterwards. And I've been reminded by the organisers to say this, and I'm going to say it because those of you who've been watching me for the last few minutes will be aware. We're all doing our best in these unusual circumstances, not least in trying to get over the challenge of working with Zoom and screen sharing. So let's hope we don't have any hitches, but if we do, please bear with us. So my presentation is just to sort of set the scene, and then Margaret and Jane will take the story from there. And what I want to do to start the discussion here is just to set the scene pre-COVID. You know, that there was already a sense of a crisis in democracy. And the late, great Peter Mayer, whose last volume was published posthumously after he passed away a few years ago, quite tragically, wrote this wonderful book on Ruling the Void, which I would heartily recommend if you've not read it yet, in which he set out a very pessimistic story about the state of democracy, talking about how democracy was being hollowed out from inside. And the sort of indicators were few of us bothering to vote, much more volatility in how we switched our votes from election to election. We're turning away from political parties, so party membership is in free fall. And this is the sort of vacuum in which populists find ready markets to take over. So it's a theme of democracy in crisis, and a theme that clearly is now even greater in the light of the COVID crisis. And the question I want to set out is whether this is overly pessimistic. You know, democracies are definitely in a moment of challenge, and not least in the last couple of weeks. But whether they're in decline is one thing. Is it possible also to look at ways in which they're innovating? And we often ignore this at our peril, that the extent to which democracies are able to innovate and are innovating. And there are various ways one could look at this, but the one that interests the three speakers today most of all is the innovations that involve engagement with citizens, regular citizens, ordinary citizens, who are, instead of angrily outside banging on the gates and protesting about things, or who in a vacuum are just ignoring politics. Here we have a context in which citizens are being brought into the room, not just metaphorically, they are actually being brought into the room to engage in serious debates about how to improve our democracy or how to help develop certain policy processes. And the table you have before you is an attempt to summarize the different kinds of what we would refer to as deliberative mini publics. There's a whole range of them there, but the one of most interest to us are the ones here on the far right, the citizens' assemblies, which started in Canada in and around 2002, and seem now to be gathering quite a pace internationally, that not just in Canada, but in a number of places. And really, first and foremost, where they have taken root is in Ireland. So we had our big moment of crisis, as we all know, 10 or 11 years ago, in the heat of the economic crash, which affected Ireland particularly badly. And in that moment of great crisis, the Irish government at that time decided to to experiment with a citizens' assembly. The first one they called the Convention on the Constitution, which operated between 2012 and 2014. And then more recently, there was the Citizens' Assembly of 2016 to 2018, and a third Citizens' Assembly whose work is now ongoing. And what citizens' assemblies entail are these three main features. There's much more to the story, but I'm just giving you some thumbnail sketches. One is the random selection of the members. So it's regular citizens who are not there to represent organized interests, or they're not there because they've been elected in some way or another. They're regular citizens who've been selected randomly, like we would for jury duty. And they're there to sort of represent a mirror of society. They're there to try and do their best as regular citizens, as ordinary citizens, to engage in a serious discussion about a particular agenda item. It's an inclusive process, so it involves experts as witnesses who help to guide the citizens and inform the citizens and bring them up to speed. Advocates on the particular issues that are being discussed are also brought into the room. And politicians can also be included. In the first of these processes, the Convention on the Constitution, regular politicians were included from the Dáil, the Seanad, and from the Northern Ireland Assembly. And the mode of operation is deliberation. This is why we refer to these things as deliberative mini-publics. So the citizens are arranged around a table with trained facilitators whose job is to try and make sure that everyone has equal voice and equal opportunity to engage in the discussion once they become informed about these things. So we've had 2 of these so far, a third Citizens' Assembly on Gender Equality, whose work has been suspended now during the COVID crisis, but it'll re-establish itself hopefully in the next coming weeks or months. And a number of things have flowed from that. There have been a number of outcomes to date, and indeed more outcomes yet to come. We've had 4 referendums in Ireland on marriage equality, presidential age, abortion, and blasphemy. At least 2 of those, the picture tells its own story there. The marriage equality and the abortion referendums, which were really path-breaking. They really set Ireland on the map internationally in showing how tough policy decisions, constitutional reform decisions, could be taken in a country like ours, demonstrating how Ireland in many ways has been modernising as a society. But the important role of this deliberative Citizens' Assembly process in helping to drive that particular agenda. We have other referendums which are being promised on the role of women, on voting age, and various others. We'll see if they come. We've had major parliamentary reforms in 2016 that follow the recommendations of the Convention on the Constitution. And recently, the Dáil declared a climate emergency. So we've had serious outcomes that have flown from that. And so, in a sense, what we are beginning to see in the Irish context is a process of mixing our normal representative system of democracy with deliberative democracy. So here is a Politics 101 chart that shows you how policy is made in any political system like Ireland's. We have some pressure for change. There's something that needs to be actioned at governmental level. The item is discussed, the matter is discussed in the government and parliament, in our parliamentary democracy. And then legislation flows, or if it requires constitutional change, there's a referendum. And what we've seen now in a couple of instances, and marriage equality and abortion are certainly the 2 most prominent examples, is the insertion of a Citizens' Assembly into the process, where the Parliament and government hand the issue over to a Citizens' Assembly to deliberate on, for the Citizens' Assembly to make recommendations that comes back to government and Parliament and then goes forward to a referendum. So we're beginning to see an interesting innovation in our democracy, and it would be great to see if this continues. And so my final slide really is just to make note of something I started with, which is that Citizens' Assemblies are part of a more general genre of deliberative mini-publics. Citizens' Assemblies are generally seen as the gold standard. And this is just taking off in the last few years. So here's a couple of logos from some of the more prominent ones. We've got a Citizens' Assembly ongoing right now in Scotland, also whose work has been suspended temporarily, and both Jane and I have some involvement in that. There's the Climate Assembly that was set up by 6 committees of the UK Parliament, again, whose work has been affected, but it's now gone online. So we have an online Citizens' Assembly continuing to work right now in the UK. Jane and I also have some involvement. The French Climate Assembly, which had a lot of influence in French debates recently, whose work is recently concluded. There's been moves in Poland, in Germany. There's the Permanent Citizens' Assembly that has been established in East Belgium by the German-speaking Communities Parliament. A recent audit by the OECD suggests that if you broaden the pool to include citizens' juries and other deliberative mini-publics, there's something like 300 of these things that have recently been ongoing or are ongoing right now. And of course, the European Union is about to establish a conference on the future of Europe, which will include, by the looks of it, a whole series of citizens' assemblies in each of the member states to help to have a debate involving citizens in the future of the European Union. So that's the sort of terrain of where we are in this panel. And I am going to finish now and hand over in a moment to Margaret, and then after that to Jane. So I now take on the role of panel chair. But let me just briefly, before I do hand over to Margaret, let me briefly just introduce Margaret to you. And then when Margaret has finished her talk, I'll introduce Jane and she can talk to you. Margaret Heffernan has asked me, given the audience that we have before us, to note that she's not the person who runs Dunnes Stores. Not that Margaret Heffernan. She's been the CEO of 5 companies in the US and the UK. She's published a number of books, notably the book Willful Blindness, How We Ignore the Obvious, which was described by the Financial Times as one of the most important books of the decade. And most recently, she's published an absolutely fabulous book called Uncharted, How to Map the Future Together, which includes some discussion about developments here in Ireland, some of which I just mentioned a few moments ago. Margaret advises business leaders around the world and is a professor of practice at the University of Bath. So I'm going to hand the floor over now to you, Margaret.
Thanks so much, David. It's a real pleasure to be contributing to this discussion. It would obviously be presumptuous of me to claim to speak for Ireland, but I think within the pandemic, there are a number of dilemmas that are facing all Western democracies and all major businesses, which are complex, which are very acute right now, and which are going to require attention as and when we come out of the pandemic. There's a lot been said about how the pandemic is a collective shared experience, and that's true. We are all in it, but I'm not sure we're all in it together. And what we can see right now is that there is a gathering storm of wildly competing interests. So in the corporate world, we're seeing a very large number of companies that have either gone bust, will go bust, or are in straitened circumstances doing massive layoffs and very hurried restructurings. They know that they will face competitors in the future, many of whom may have had more governmental support than they've had. They are asking for or expressing a need for debt relief, for rent relief, for wage relief, and for tax relief. The insurance companies that they may work with aren't going to carry the can because they would go bust if they did. The suppliers and small businesses that many of these companies work with are very vulnerable to the decisions that their larger customers are making, and many of them have far less resilience than these larger companies. But on the other hand, the larger companies can't function without them. Investors really want their dividends, but the funds required to pay dividends are also needed to keep the companies alive, to keep the workforce employed, to be able to support and pay their suppliers. Pension funds want their dividends because dividends are an absolutely fundamental part of the business model of pension funds. And of course, the elderly and retired and those approaching retirement absolutely want those pension funds to stay flush because otherwise their retirement isn't guaranteed. In the meantime, you see a young generation that has just had their careers stopped in the middle of beginning. So you have young people whose social life, their professional development has been completely stalled. They know that when we come out of the pandemic, there will be very, very high unemployment. I think The Economist today estimated that in Ireland, by June, unemployment will stand at 22%. Pity the young graduate who is last in the line looking for a new job with no experience. So they feel aggrieved and they need support and help to become fruitful members of society in the future. And then we have, of course, the vast army of essential workers, nurses, porters, home care workers, supermarket shelf stackers, who have literally kept us alive through this crisis, but who are among the worst paid and most insecure workers in our economy. They feel entitled, excuse me, to some kind of reward or recompense, and many members of the public feel that they're entitled to that for keeping society going during lockdown. So everyone is in the queue, and everyone feels that they are entitled to be first in the queue. But there isn't any money. So how on earth is this going to be resolved? Clearly, sacrifice will be required. Sacrifice should be required of everyone. Whether it will be or not remains to be seen. The lobbying has clearly already begun. You can hear the clamor of petitioners above the sirens of ambulances. So the question is, in companies and within society at large, how is this phenomenal contest for reparation going to be met? We faced something quite similar in 2008 after the banking crisis, and what happened? Well, those who were most responsible got off most lightly, and those who were least responsible and most vulnerable ended up paying the price. We can't go down that road again. If, as David says, we're seeing some hollowing out of democracy, one reason has been that the democratic processes at work in 2008 did not serve society as a whole. And the grievance that that created has not gone away. In fact, you could argue it's part of what underlies the rise of populism. So who's going to pay the bill this time? What's needed, I think, is a much better process than we saw in 2008, one that looks for collective redress, and however painful the inevitable trade-offs are going to be, we need processes in place which might make it possible for people to feel that the settlement has been legitimate, that however much we're all hurting, the process and decision-making has, in fact, at least been fair. Now, there are a number of ways I can imagine how to do this within companies. Typically, when companies are in crisis, what happens is the senior leadership team goes off for a long weekend, usually to a swanky hotel, and they put their heads together and they decide what's going to happen. They come up with a change plan or rescue plan or transformation plan, and then they try very hard to sell it to the workforce that has typically had no voice in this matter. It's possible to do this differently, and I've certainly known companies that have, where instead of the senior leadership trying to come up with all of the answers, recognizing that there is frequently much more knowledge at the edge of a company than at the center, they have asked the workforce to work on recommendations for making the company more resilient, more robust, and more capable of facing the future. And they frequently ask for champions of particular solutions, knowing that when an initiative is championed, it's more likely to be seen as legitimate and to be pushed through by those who understand where it came from and why. Those recommendations are put to senior leadership, and the consequence is a change plan that emerges that has far more in the way of legitimacy, support, and understanding before it even begins. So in this, following David's model, essentially you have an executive committee that pretty much plays the same role as Parliament, hugely informed by the vast experience and wildly differing knowledge and lived experience inside the corporation. It can lead to initiatives and new ways of working, which are seen as fairer, more appropriate, more up to date, and more widely supported because they haven't been imposed from above, but have come from those who are doing the work and who have to live with the recommendations that they've generated for themselves. I think there's a much bigger question, which is when you think about the role that many companies play across society as a whole, the impact that a company can have on equality, on the environment, on healthcare, on social practices. It's going to be interesting to see how far we can use the kind of deliberative processes that David's been talking about to inform a cross-sectoral discussion about who and what in the post-pandemic settlement takes priority. In the past, we trusted elites to forge new world orders. That's what happened in Bretton Woods. I think right now that feels archaic. I think it feels too remote, and it's very hard to find a group of elites that can command the trust and faith of the population at large. I think it's fair to say that the example of citizens' assemblies in Ireland has absolutely inspired the world. And one reason it's done that is because it demonstrated something which I think people didn't entirely realize that they needed until they saw it happen, which is that the process of your assemblies created a circumstance in which laws could change, and even those who might not have agreed with the outcome could feel okay about it because the process had been legitimate. Everybody felt heard. They believed and understood that they'd been able to take part in the process directly or at some distance. They understood that all perspectives had been taken and that the outcome was based on a broad base of understanding, of experience, of the cross-section of the population, not only a tiny sliver of it. I think that has to be our gold standard as we move towards what are bound to be painful trade-offs, that we aim for decisions which even those who don't agree with them can regard as legitimate because of the way in which those decisions were made and the quality and breadth of participation that led to them. Someone I interviewed for my book, apart from David, encapsulated this very beautifully, and they said, social problems require social processes. The new world order post-pandemic, I think, is very frightening, and it's very murky, and there is no one, no person, no institution that can claim experience or expertise. We are in completely uncharted territory. What we can be sure of is that whatever it looks like, for it to work will require legitimacy in order to be able to craft it with speed, in order to get some kind of viable economy and society back to business in the face of complexity and uncertainty that are not going to go away. I don't think we can leave this to the mood swings of the elites. The crisis is too grave, it's too pervasive, and it's absolutely immune to simple answers. Just as we've seen that this has been a moment of profound innovation in things like vaccines and ventilators, I think now we have an opportunity to take all the learning that David and his colleagues in many institutions the world over have learned from deliberative democracy to inform and strengthen and drive a new but valid vision for the future for everyone. Thanks.
Thank you, Margaret. Thank you very much. And I've already seen questions coming in, so we'll get to them in due course. So please do continue sending in your questions. Now, our final speaker is Jane Souter, who will be known, I imagine, to many of the people looking on here. She's an associate professor at DCU and is the director of the Institute for Future Media and Journalism. Jane and I have worked very closely now over the past decade on the various Citizens' Assembly projects here in Ireland, and also on ongoing citizens' assemblies elsewhere. And she is a member of the OECD's Innovative Citizen Participation Network. I hand the floor to you, Jane.
Thanks very much. Thanks very much, David. I'm just going to share my PowerPoint here. So lovely to see so many people here, even if I can't see all your faces. I imagine that's just to look after our bandwidths or whatever. But looking forward to our discussion afterwards. I saw Liam and Stephen put this up in the beginning when they were planning this series, and I thought, oh, that's really exciting. And then very quickly, Liam came in and said he wanted to talk to David and I. And so I've been kind of having a think about it ever since. So I wanted to do sort of a few things here today. But I suppose the main thing we want to think about is really what the kind of the political and social response to the pandemic, what the appropriate kind of COVID response is. And I think a lot of Margaret's thoughts there are very interesting, and hopefully there'll be some that I'll circle back to at the end. But I think really a big part of it is that a lot of the measures that are require the kind of behavioural change and impacts on our freedom and our privacy that aren't normal in non-authoritarian societies. And in order for governments to undertake them, they require a good deal of trust and of legitimacy. As even the WHO has noted, that's very much under pressure, both from falling levels of trust, but also rising levels of disinformation, and also to some extent, I think, through lack of inclusion of different perspectives. We need to know where the different perspectives are coming from. One of the interesting papers I've seen recently, comes from Spencer McKay, who's a postdoc fellow in NYU, and he put this up recently. But we see a lot of headlines are the ones you see there from the New York Times and the Guardian about, how the virus is really a problem for democracy. And a lot of the time they're looking at, of course, Viktor Orban in Hungary, and then our fellow EU citizens in Poland, but also at measures in the US and so on. And so we know that there's a lot of problems in terms of giving authoritarians the kind of opportunity and the space to increase measures. And there's a lot of thinkers from different areas looking at this. So we have people like Amartya Sen, who is an economist and a philosopher who's now in Harvard, who's calling for more participatory governance in the like of this. Or people like Arkham Fung, it's also actually in Harvard, who's arguing for more democracy, not less, for more participation. But I think a lot of us who actually work in this think it's not just participation that's needed. We actually need more deliberation as well. So I think to be able to look at this today, I don't have much time, but I just thought it'd be interesting to kind of very quickly go through a few different questions. So the first one is to ask whether scaling up deliberation, can we scale up deliberation to the extent that it's required now in this kind of pandemic and hopefully post-pandemic sort of environment? And then what are citizens' attitudes? So that's the kind of supply side, if you like, but from the demand side, what are citizens' attitudes to decision making in a crisis? We can expect different things. People change their minds and have different authoritarian preferences when they're feeling under threat. And then thirdly, I'd like to just very quickly propose, and hopefully maybe we can have a debate with all the people who are on this call afterwards about, could we actually think about being a leader in this? As Margaret was saying, we were a leader before in terms of our citizens' assemblies on abortion and marriage equality and so on. Can we think about it in pandemic terms as well? So the first question is about this possibility of scaling up from what are micro level processes. So the 100 people sitting in the room in the Grand Hotel in Malahide that we had for marriage equality and abortion, and the other processes to what we call the macro levels, so to citizens in wider society. And there's a lot of unanswered hard questions still about this sort of scalability and about the kind of influence that citizens' assemblies can have on the wider public. And we know from the individual level that there's all sorts of things. You know, we know that they boost coherent policy attitudes and increase kind of democratic legitimacy beliefs, political efficacy, the complexity of thinking, the quality of political knowledge and judgments, and so on. But we're just not sure to the extent to which it scales up. And we also we know that going through a process like this can deepen empathy and other regarding behaviour, and I think that's part of it that's going to be absolutely crucial in the environment that we're facing into. So I wanted to share a couple of experiments. This first paper is a paper that David and I have been working on with colleagues Lala Muradova in KU Leuven and John Gastill in Penn State. It's under review so at the moment, so I haven't put the journal title in yet. But we were looking at the possibility of scaling up, and we did it in reference to the blasphemy referendum that David referred to there earlier, which had been discussed in the 2012 to 2014 Constitutional Convention, but the referendum didn't actually happen until just over a year or so ago. And what we did is we designed vignettes which were summaries of the information and the pros and cons and the decision making within the Citizen Assembly or mini public relation to blasphemy, to see whether they made a difference to people in this experimental setting when they read them. So the first thing we looked at were the factual knowledge effects, and so whether people hearing about a citizen assembly had an increase in knowledge. The first one there is our control condition, where people didn't see any of the different key findings. And what we find here, you'll see that when something is to the right, it's a positive effect, to the left a negative effect, and the tails are 95% confidence intervals. But I'm sure most of you know that. I'm just not sure who exactly is on the call. But we found that in 3 out of 6 of our knowledge effects, there was a significant impact on people. And this actually fits with other papers that myself and David have written with Jos Elking of UCD, where we found that those who had more knowledge of the Citizen Assembly were more likely to vote in favour of it, and were more likely to be correct in their objective knowledge on it. We also ran some experiments on the effect on people's other regarding attitudes, so the impact on empathy. So this is the result of a regression on that. And we can see here that when people are exposed to the key findings and to the pro-con statements around an issue, that it increases their empathy, so their thoughts and their feelings for people on the other side of the attitude spectrum from themselves. So we think that these were, encouraging findings about the potential of scaling up. Deliberation. So just to sum up there, non-participating citizens can gain significant increases in knowledge, and also increase their empathy for the other side. So we hope that these will be helpful. The second experiment that I wanted to talk to you about briefly is one that I just ran on April 11th and 12th, I think it was, with Lala Muradova and KU Leuven. It's registered there at the Open Science Foundation. We did a pre-registration, so just in case somebody was interested in looking at it. But we wanted to look at the citizen participation, the kind of the demand side, in terms of the COVID-19 pandemic. So we know on the one hand, we've got the literature which says, which Margaret was referring to there and David, and indeed Arkham Fung and so on, which is that citizen participation is a good thing, and it leads to increased legitimacy and so on. But on the other hand, we have evidence that at a time of crisis, people look for more authoritarian leadership, and they more want to just simply follow experts and so on. So we designed vignettes. This was mid-April, where we said that the government had decided to expand the lockdown until mid-May. And then, you know, it was a between subject vignette kind of design. One of the things we looked at is whether people were willing to comply with the lockdown measures for as long as it takes. So if you think about it, this was, you know, a couple of weeks ago, and we were thinking, people were thinking that they might be coming out of it this Monday. And we'd said, look, it was going to mid-May, and then we asked, would you do it for as long as it takes? And I think the interesting thing here is these are very preliminary findings. We've only just had the data in, as you can imagine. It was done in Prolific, so we're interested in doing follow-ups and doing it with representative samples. We have funding applications in for that. But this very initial data shows us that there's actually high trust in Ireland, but indeed also in the US and the UK towards government in this time. And there's reasonably good attitude toward the sort of measures that have been taken at the moment. And, you know, I heard Liam on Morning Ireland this morning, you know, talking about that, kind of the Irish survey where responses, which the behavioural unit that he's part of have been looking at. But I think one of the interesting things here is actually the mean compliance, so our willingness to comply for as long as it takes. And you can see in Ireland that's actually a little bit lower. So we're beginning even in mid-April to question this a little bit. So I think thinking about how to increase that compliance is definitely something that might want to be part of the government response. We also looked at people's interpersonal trust and then their trust in citizens' assemblies. And we can see that the trust in citizens' assemblies is very high. And interestingly, across all three policies, it's higher in Ireland than in the US and the UK. And that's not surprising. We have, you know, greater experience of them. People are well aware what citizens' assemblies are, but there have been much greater numbers of them in the UK recently and the US. So I think this is probably encouraging longer term for using some sort of citizens' assembly, you know, for some of our COVID deliberations. And interestingly, we looked as well at the mean strong government preferences, and we saw, as expected, that people did indeed have very strong government preferences at the current time. And this was particularly the case in the US. And one of the things these were mediated most by was actually people's concern responses, fear responses, their how impacted they had been by the virus so far, and that kind of thing. So we think that there's two layers of response in terms of people's willingness to be brought along more authoritarian routes and their wanting for more citizen involvement. And this is something that we definitely want to do some more work on. But just to go back, as David said, you know, there's a lot of citizen assemblies going on around the world, a lot inspired by Ireland. The OECD has been pushing it. But a lot of them are thinking more about going online. And in fact, the one in the Westminster Committees on Climate Change that David's been working more on is going online. The Scottish Citizen Assembly are both working on the French one on climate, and the OECD is pushing out working papers. So I think this is something that we can definitely think about at the moment before we can actually go back to face-to-face ones. So one of the things we've been thinking about is, well, what sort of platform can you actually use? And the Science Foundation Ireland ADAPT Centre has a platform called Fuse. It was used in DCU and maybe TUD and somewhere else recently to facilitate large-scale discussion about what people want in the future. And it now has a Zoom plugin, so it can actually be used for video evidence. So it might be something that could be used. And it's possible we could look at sort of the short-term kind of things that we're looking at now. So short-term compliance with lockdown privacy concerns over some of these apps that people are talking about, but also longer term policy measures. So the kind of things Margaret was talking about, you know, which sector do we want to support? We have all these different demands. We've had all of this changing policy. So what way do we want to look at it? What do we want to actually prioritize now? Which groups, which policies, what things do we want to bake in? You know, what sort of normal do we want to try to get back to? Who do we need to support? And I think possibly bringing in citizens to look at this is going to be one way to build legitimacy for it, but also to ensure that citizens' voices are actually heard. As Margaret said, all of the vested interests are in lobbying already. We hear their voices, but we're not actually hearing the voices of the citizens. And I think something like this is one way to actually prioritize the voice of citizens in terms of whatever future measures it is that we're going to take. So anyway, I look forward to discussion with you all. Thank you all very much.
Thanks, Jane. Maybe if Jane and Margaret keep their microphones open, that might facilitate things more quickly. So thank you for the presentations. We're pretty much on schedule as far as I can see. I believe we have until 1:30. So we have 50 minutes, so we'll see how we go. I have 9 questions. Some of them are quite wordy, and I'm told by the organizers I should read out or refer to the questions, and then we work our way through them. So for now, I'm going to start with the early ones, but as these flow in, I may have to skip a few. So Niamh Bratnick was the first one to ask a question, and she says, I worry about the Greta movement. I think we may have lost Margaret, but hopefully she'll dial back in at some stage. Oh no, she's back. There we go. Niamh says, I worry about the Greta movement. Is it time to host a young people assembly to give her young supporters a voice? I'm going to be chair for a bit. So Jane, can I throw that one at you? What do you think?
I think so, absolutely. So, you know, one of the things we've seen is that young people aren't having much of a voice. We've seen that even in terms of, you know, discussions around education and so on, and they're all sitting at home at the moment. And I think it could be a very powerful thing to do. And we have a lot of the evidence already, including video evidence, when we ran our own citizen assembly on climate change. Some of that could be reused. We could get new people in. There's been a lot of movement since. And the new government is certainly potentially looking at how we're going to tackle climate. So to have the voice of the young would be useful. I was on a call about the Scottish Assembly on climate yesterday, and we were discussing whether to actually oversample the kind of 16 to 18-year-olds, because we don't even hear from the 4 to 16-year-olds. So I think this could be, I'd love to see something like that, Niamh.
Okay. Margaret, I got a question for you from Conor Cashman. Do you see a disparity in how countries are defining the term essential workers and the implications this may have for how entitled workers may be viewed post-crisis?
There's definitely a difference between the US and the UK, which are the 2 places I know best, because of course the US doesn't have any sort of national health service. And so kind of who turns up and why and how is kind of wildly anomalous all over the place. I would also say that, you know, in the United States, there is a much less, if you like, coherent narrative about the relationship between citizens and the people doing essential work. So some see that as being market driven because US healthcare is a business, not a public service. And some of it is very ideologically driven. But I think that, so I think it varies from place to place. In Germany, clearly there's a very clear recognition of essential workers, but a slightly different attitude, because the sort of view is because they're pretty well paid, that they're doing their job, and that's what you should do, right? Whereas I think here in the UK, there's a sense that it's almost miraculous what very, very poorly paid often denigrated um, people in contractually very weak positions are nevertheless prepared to do for the rest of us. And I think certainly here that has really awakened a sense that, you know, the gig economy and dependence on, you know, very, very precarious work practices has really gone way, way, way too far, and that whatever the post-pandemic settlement looks like, it definitely has to deal with that as a source of injustice and fragility.
Okay, thank you. There's been a couple of questions on the sort of digital divide theme, Jane. I'll give you a sample of one or two of them here. If assemblies move online, because as we've been noting, that's now happening by virtue of what we're going through, how do you overcome the potential disparity in knowledge of technology to ensure that they are still a cross-section? And let me piggyback with a more pointed one from Marion Coy. COVID exposes the invisibility and silence of the elderly in nursing homes. How do we give a voice to this group where it may not be possible to rely on digital communication?
Yeah, well, I think this is always an issue, and it's one of the reasons why we didn't have online deliberation. And you know, one of the reasons it was seen as you know, kind of very much a poor relation of face-to-face deliberation, and you know, having our 100 citizens in the Grand Hotel and so on. But on the other hand, if it's going to happen in the short term, it's where we need to go. So around the world, organisers have been doing different things. So, for example, you know, laptops are being given to all of the participants who were selected and so on, to make sure that they can, or Wi-Fi was being paid for you know, particular citizens who were part of the panel who didn't have it. And they're looking at those kind of things in Canada and so on. I'm sure if we wanted to include people in nursing homes, then most nursing homes do actually have Wi-Fi. Older people are learning how to use different communication, but I'm sure with the help of their carers, we could record some videos. You know, people could be helped. So we obviously can't do the impossible, but there's, you know, a lot of steps that can be taken to try to include as many people as possible. You know, I think we've all seen over the last 6 weeks the extent to which we can move these things actually quite quickly, and the extent that people can be helped to communicate in different ways.
Yeah, I mean, I entirely agree. There was another question that just came in about the difficulties or the challenges in moving a citizens' assembly online. And do we think citizens will be positive regarding this option? And of course, as you know, Jane, we have that ongoing right now. In particular, in the case of the UK Climate Assembly, which there's a sort of, I suppose, a wonderful irony, if I could use that term, because of the COVID crisis, we've now got a citizens' assembly that's devoted to climate change, that instead of flying or training or driving their citizen members into the meeting in Birmingham, are now forced to go online. And they've done this so far with one weekend since the COVID crisis, and the evidence seems to suggest that it's going pretty well, which makes me wonder, going down the road, that if you were going to use online processes for citizens' assemblies, what seems to have worked in the case of the UK Climate Assembly is that they started with face-to-face meetings in a hotel ballroom, which allowed for the getting to know each other. And now they can go online because they're more familiar with each other. And so it would be really good to see how we might be able to trial that in the future.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's the hybrid idea, I think is really compelling. I think, you know, from all the people I've interviewed who took part in the Citizens' Assembly in Dublin, I think one of the things that's really striking is how far people listened to people not like themselves with whom they might disagree, because they had to. And, you know, because they were constrained from being rude by their own sort of sense of politeness. And listening to people whom at first they thought they had nothing in common with, or that they really disagreed with, clearly changed people's minds. You know, that they might start off thinking, well, I don't agree with him, he's an idiot. And then because they had to listen, really started to see where the ideas came from, or the the way that other people thought in different ways that they could themselves learn from. So I'd be terribly wary of going online whole hog. I think you're right that, to the degree people get to know each other and they have to socialize. And unless they're really unpleasant people, they do make an effort to get along. The openness to other experiences and attitudes is clearly a profound part of the whole process.
Okay, thank you. Some of these questions are so wordy, it takes me so long to read through them. So forgive me if I'm a little bit clunky at this stage. Okay, Marion Coy had a question at the start, which was this. Let me read it out. Are there any deliberative processes which can assist in engaging disaffected citizens and or those who feel themselves to be on the losing side in social change in Ireland? She said, I'm often questioned by those who feel that their beliefs, positions are in some way surreptitiously undermined by the use of citizens' assemblies. She says, I'm also keen to see how assemblies might be used effectively as part of the process of reforming local government in Ireland. So she's tagged on a very precise question. But Jane, can I ask you to maybe reflect on that question and have a first go, maybe, if that's okay?
Yeah, one of the things is that if you're going to have a binary question, which, for example, will we repeal the Eighth Amendment or not? Will we call for a referendum on it or not? It's a fairly binary question, and therefore, by definition, there's going to be some people who feel strongly about one side, and their side isn't going to be the dominant side, and that's. It's just part of it. If you're going to be asked a referendum, yes or no question, there's just no way of getting away from the kind of binary nature of it. So what we have to do is look at what's called losers' consent. Now, we don't, unfortunately, have very extensive data to talk about losers' consent, but we do have some, and we do have some interview data to talk about it. And certainly the interviews I conducted, and I'd be interested to hear Margaret talk more about the ones that she conducted, people felt that their side had been represented, that it had been heard. They felt when we did the questionnaires before and after every weekend that there had been equality of voice, that people hadn't been dominating. And that they had been able to, have their spake, if you like. So those outside of the process might feel that, well, these two, especially marriage equality and the Eighth, moved in a progressive dimension, and therefore, if you're more conservative, you might feel that they weren't following you. But on the other hand, what we find is that they were also going with the direction of society. So I think the important thing is that people can see that it was ordinary people like them who were coming to those decisions and who were changing their minds. And there were people in those assemblies who, for example, didn't feel themselves that they might be in favor of, in any way in favor of abortion, but they recognized that it was an option that other people might, in some difficult circumstances, have to deal with, and they didn't feel that it should be them who would stop it. So I think when people kind of see that, they recognize that society moves, and we have to increase our empathy, we have to increase our thinking about other people, and I think that's one thing that these assemblies did.
Okay, thank you. I have a question from Natasha, and I was going to give a quick answer to it if I could, and then maybe target a question at Margaret out of it. Natasha says, I read that the Yorkshire Citizens Assembly proposes involving people pitching to local businesses and investors for funding as a pragmatic mechanism post-COVID-19. Would this be an appropriate way to evolve, or are there ethical concerns? And Jane and I had that particular aspect, I suppose, at the beginning of the Irish piece, which was in 2011. We got funding from Atlantic Philanthropies to organise our first Citizens Assembly, the We the Citizens process in 2011, which was designed to try and promote the idea in Ireland, and we think with some success. And there were ethical concerns, undoubtedly, because we were getting funding, substantial funding, from Atlantic Philanthropies. And I know from outside there were people who were questioning whether we were able to run our process independently. And whenever asked, I always say yes. Atlantic were very careful in making sure that when we got the funding, that was a project that we would run ourselves. We got advice, we sought advice where we needed it, but there was a clear divide between the funder and ourselves. But it does make me wonder about some of the issues that I've seen in Margaret's recent article in the Sunday Business Post, or Business Post as we call it these days, and your remarks earlier on, Margaret, about, if we're thinking about something like this in the workplace, I mean, presumably the model is that you're going to go to some corporation and you're going to sell the idea to them. There's a sort of power dynamic within that organization that perhaps constrains the potential for running a process like this within. How do you think you would get around that problem?
Well, I think the only way is to do pretty much what you did, which is that the process has to be run by an external third party that has no vested interest in the outcome. So some of the organizations that I'm discussing it with here in the UK, the issue is, can outsiders help define and lead a process which the corporation benefits from because it gets the benefits from the participation of people, but where the participants don't need to feel in fear of repercussions. Because I think that's a very, very real issue. And so I think having someone that stands between the body that receives the recommendations and the people who generate the recommendations is really fundamental. Because clearly these are not processes that are going to work if people feel that they can't be open and honest.
Yeah, okay, thank you. Jane, I have a question here for you from Anya Micah Green. Forgive the mispronunciation of your name. She says, how can assemblies respond to the pace of change as the effects of the crisis are unfolding every day? If we respond too quickly, our conclusions may be irrelevant. But if we delay, others could dominate the agenda for change. Given your sort of proposal at the end of your talk, have you given some thought to that particular conundrum?
Yeah.
Well, sorry, who is the question directed at?
I was going to throw it at Jane, but Margaret, you're welcome to jump in first if you want.
Oh, go ahead, Jane, please.
Okay, well, that was part of the reason why I had the kind of the short term and the longer term things that we could be discussing, perhaps even in parallel streams. So in the short term, I think it's in terms of ensuring that people feel that their voice has been listened to, or that indeed our leaders are listening to all appropriate kind of public health and epidemiological and other kind of experts, that we would talk about the kind of the apps and the extent of the lockdown and all that kind of thing. But then also in the longer term, talk about, we could even crowdsource what are the issues that people want to talk about. So we could look further at climate, but also at the kind of generational thing. So, how do we ensure that, younger generations don't suffer the worst effects of this, which is, something that's quite possible. Or we could go on a kind of a sectoral kind of point of view and think about, well, where, we've got this clamour from all these vested interests about, about who wants to be protected, but who is it? Should we be protecting Ryanair or restaurants or universities, or, where is it that we want to target our attention? So I think we can do both of these in parallel, Anya.
Okay, thank you. Margaret, did you want to come in on that also?
Yeah, I mean, I think one of the things that's so impressive about the citizens' assemblies that I've studied that took place in Ireland is that clearly the participants were able to think beyond themselves. Not just about what they wanted for themselves, but their role within society. And they seem to have been very, very good at making trade-offs, of thinking, this might not be what I want for myself, but as Jane was saying, I don't think it's my right to stop someone else having access to this. And I think that, that's a kind of model of ethical thinking, which is one of the strengths of the process. One of the things that I've seen in Wales, they've created a thing called the Commission for Future Generations. And the commissioner or the office of the commissioner has been doing huge amounts of public deliberation across the country, looking at not just what young people want, but also what parents want for their children, or even what young people think they would want for their children. And I think what's been really useful about that open and deliberation, and quite a lot of it, has been getting unheard voices heard and being able to craft what I would think of as guiding principles for public policy. So not so much we want this or we want that, but we want goals that are not necessarily pure economic goals. So the Welsh government now has a whole series of goals for any public policy, which is about, a healthier Wales, a socially more cohesive Wales, a more equal Wales, a culturally vibrant Wales, and so on and so forth. And so instead of just doing what most governments have done, certainly in our lifetime, which is to think the only thing that matters is economic growth, they have, through these very rich national public conversations, created a different sense of a positive identity for the country, which is then used to hold public bodies to account. So for example, if you're building a new motorway, is this going to make the country healthier? Is it going to make it more equal? Is it going to create a healthier environment, and so on and so forth? And if it doesn't, then perhaps it shouldn't happen. And I think this is quite an interesting kind of middle way, in the sense that it's created different principles according to which day-to-day decisions about public policy and public spending are judged.
You sort of somewhat also now answered, I think I'm right, a question by Jane Morgan, but let me read it out. Jane says, I think the macro question is, what motivates leaders to support, enable, pay for citizens' assembly, or action research type approach to engagement? So for those in power, what is the motivation? And I think, if I'm getting you, Margaret, it's not just money. There are other reasons why one might want to go down a road like this. But I suppose the other one is that, and maybe Jane might want to come in as well on this, I don't know, but in a sense, it speaks to the courage of political leaders, I would suggest. And sometimes one can be naive in making these points, but it took great courage in 2012 for Enda Kenny and Eamon Gilmore as Taoiseach and Taoiseach to go down this strange road of establishing a convention on the Constitution that could have gone badly pear-shaped, and giving it important agenda items like marriage equality, where effectively a Taoiseach was handing over a great degree of control over that agenda in that way. So the courage of the political leadership at times like this is, I think, a very important factor that we shouldn't underestimate.
No, I would absolutely agree with this, and let's not forget that they took quite a lot of flack for doing so, and were accused of kicking the can down the road and kind of not doing their job, as it were. And but I think there are two big incentives. The first is there are these intractable problems that have to be solved somehow. So there is, so if the existing processes don't work, something has got to be found. But I think the big prize is legitimacy, which is a sense that you can't be accused of self-interest or greed or corruption or whatever if the recommendation comes from a broad base of citizens. And certainly in the corporate environment, I would say that where those kinds of decisions come from the workforce as a whole, getting them accepted and implemented is so much faster. It's amazing to me that this isn't used more broadly, because the challenge with any piece of new ruling is not just, writing it and getting it voted for, but actually getting people to follow it. And if it's seen to come from us, then half that battle's done.
Jane, did you want to come in on that also?
Yeah, like very much kind of what both of you are saying. And, you know, one thing that always struck me after the first Constitutional Convention, when the politicians were actually involved and in the room, I was talking to one of them, and what struck him most is that his usual interaction with citizens had been where the citizen was looking for something. So, you know, something to do with the new sports field or the new school or the road or, you know, something like this, or a medical card, whatever it was. And that he wasn't used to dealing with citizens as a kind of an interest in terms of overall policy. And so all of the policy demands that he was used to all came from very well organised, very well funded vested interests. And it was difficult to say no to them quite often because they put in really good campaigns. And it was really interesting to actually listen to citizens in terms of policies. And then it would actually give ammunition to be able to go back to vested interests and say, well, actually, you know, we can't necessarily do what it is that you're saying because, you know, there's something else that's there's a different view from the citizens. So it provides that kind of cover as well as that ability to work over kind of sticky problems. So you know, I think it does require bravery, but you know, I think it's also useful for politicians as well.
Okay, here's a question from Shauna Glennon. The Irish Convention on the Constitution included both ordinary citizens and elected representatives, whereas the subsequent citizens' assemblies are comprised of citizens only. Would it make future deliberative assemblies more impactful to include politicians, or are there better ways to connect or couple citizens' assemblies to the institutions of representative democracy? Jane, what are your reflections on that?
Well, we were all very sceptical in the beginning of having the politicians in the room for the first one. We thought they might dominate, but in fact, all the research showed that they were very well behaved at round tables and didn't dominate, and in fact enjoyed it. And certainly, I know some of the politicians who were involved would very much like to be involved again, as would many of the citizens who were involved in earlier ones. They'd love to be involved again. I think what the important thing is, though, is that there is that coupling that Sean is talking about. And it doesn't have to be that the politicians are in the room and actually deliberating. In the last assembly, it was very interesting in the two which actually resulted in outputs. So on the 8th and on climate change, the Dáil set up a special parliamentary committee just to consider the report and the output of the Citizen Assembly. So it spent its own time, called many of the same experts, and really went into the report in detail. So I think, yeah, we need that coupling. We need something, but it can actually be done from within the houses of the Oireachtas as well. But it needs that commitment, and I think it needs a greater commitment than just a debate on the floor of the House, you know, which could take an hour or two. I think the model of having the special parliamentary committee that's going to consider the report is quite a powerful one.
Yeah, because Margaret, as Jane was saying, one of the features of the first of the Irish processes, as you know yourself, was the fact that the politicians were included, so that when there were future processes, there was a sympathetic ear within the Irish Parliament to allow for the possibility of having these things and giving them serious agenda items. Do you have any sort of sense of, let's say in the UK system, where you know better than we would, you know, what the potential would be for serious engagement by a UK government in the absence of having tried something like this themselves?
Yeah, it's a really interesting question because I think certainly in the UK there's a lot of misunderstanding about what citizens' assemblies are. You know, they're regularly written off as just kind of talking shops or kind of random bunches of people swapping opinions. And I think, you know, it's, and I keep trying to, you know, explain to people, you know, they really need to look at the meticulous attention to detail that you can see in the planning and the execution of both the Irish, the first two citizens' assemblies. It's tricky, and I think it's tricky because of the problem of power. You know, one of the problems of power is that people in leadership positions are quite remote. And so you can see that actually being amongst citizens could be really helpful. As long as the politicians don't expect their voice to have any extra weight. And it's interesting, I've written about quite a different sort of exercise that took place in Mexico, where every single person who spoke was specifically time limited. And so an archbishop had as much time as an indigenous woman who works with victims of domestic violence. Now, to the archbishop, that was a deeply shocking experience, that his voice had no more weight than a woman of a kind that he had never met before. So I think that can be quite an interesting way of ensuring that voices don't dominate. But it's tricky within the structure of citizens' assemblies because so much, it seems to me, of the value is all the side conversations and the informal conversations and the way that people get to know one another. And so I honestly don't know. I mean, my inclination is that there's real value to politicians understanding and being able somehow to witness the rigor of the process. And the fact that, it was all webcast in Ireland the second time around, I think was really valuable. I just hope they watched it.
Okay, here's a question from Rory O'Donnell from this parish in Geary. He says, hasn't the COVID crisis prompted a form of engagement quite different from citizens' assemblies? Government engagement with groups and organizations that have deep expertise in specific areas, medical, retail, and so on. And there's every reason to think that there will be many further examples. There's every reason to think there'll be many further examples such as that. He says, is it not claiming a bit to say that deliberative mini-publics are at what I describe as the gold standard? So in a sense, I suppose what Rory's challenging us to reflect on is, citizens' assemblies maybe have a role in other ways, but in the specifics of the COVID crisis, should we just not be engaging with the experts? Is that not a better route to trying to help resolve matters?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's difficult. I've been working with lots of organizations that are immediately impacted by the crisis, and I would say there's definitely evidence that you have a phenomenal accelerated collaboration between government and different companies and institutions and civic bodies. I would also say that there is evidence that this is the most almighty car crash I've seen in a long time, where a lot of goodwill and energy and private resource and initiative has been exploited and trampled on by government that just doesn't know how to be a good client, doesn't know how to interoperate with entrepreneurs, isn't very good at working with business, thinks it knows everything, doesn't know everything, and so on. So I'm very wary of the narrative that says we've seen this great flowering of collaboration. Undoubtedly in some areas we have, and undoubtedly in some areas we have seen the exact opposite. And I think what this tells us is something that is generally true of this crisis, which is that for every phenomenon we're witnessing, there is an equal and opposite phenomenon. It is both very collective and highly individual. It's very collaborative and deeply competitive. There are going to be great stories to tell about this when people have the time and the freedom to do so. But there is no one COVID-19 narrative. There is every narrative you can imagine, good and bad. You have people looking after their neighbors, and you have nurses being mugged on the streets.
Very good. I suppose another dimension I bring in response to Rory's question is, as I was setting out in my earlier slide, the Citizens' Assembly, if it's going to work properly, needs the expertise in the room. So the expertise comes into the room to bring the citizen members up to speed. And it provides an opportunity to get a sounding board for how citizens might react to some proposals, as Jane was suggesting in one of your experiments there, Jane. So in a sense, by providing that sounding board in a calm, reflective arena outside of the ping pong of parliamentary politics, it helps to inform and guide the politicians in taking some of the tough decisions that they might need to take.
I mean, I think that's right. And I also think, you know, it's phenomenally liberating to escape from the narrative of winning and losing, which is the predominant political narrative, which is a sort of, you know, I'll say anything, whether it's true or not, to get the vote. And I think the emphasis which citizen assemblies places on evidence and true expertise as opposed to lobbying groups is a really essential reset in the age of fake news.
Yeah, exactly. Okay, Jane, here's one for you from Mark Callanan, who says thanks to the three of us for our presentations. Thanks, Mark. He says there's a lot of research suggesting deliberative and participative exercises can be dominated by the educated and well-heeled in society. Notwithstanding the benefits of random sampling in the specific instances of the Citizens' Assembly, are there ways to ensure that harder to reach sections of society reflected in assemblies don't become marginal in such exercises or relegated to the status of backseat drivers? Jane?
I'm not sure that there that I've seen a lot of research which shows that that they're dominated. There's certainly a lot of research which shows that participatory exercises can be dominated in that way, but there's a lot of work that goes into the random sampling of people across different groups and choosing which groups to sample against. In Ireland, we've kept it fairly simple, but in Scotland and elsewhere, they go into, you know, quite a lot of detail of kind of quite micro sampling to try to get different people. Now, of course, there always are what are called stealth Democrats in the political science literature. So people who just, you know, believe that experts should make the decision and that it's not really the place of the people, and it's going to be hard to get those people in the room. But then to the second part of Mark's question, when you're talking about relegating people within the exercise, one of the crucial parts of deliberation is the facilitation, and having really well-trained, very professional facilitators. And it's their job to make sure that the more educated and the more articulate and the more naturally talkative don't get to dominate, and to ensure that the more introverted and those less used to speaking up do actually manage to speak up. And there's plenty of evidence that David and I have from our before and after surveys across numerous weekends that this in fact happens. And actually in the Irish Citizen Assemblies, we have note takers on the tables as well as facilitators. And these note takers actually note down every time somebody speaks. So we can actually have a record afterwards to make sure that there weren't particular voices dominating, as well as asking people afterwards whether they felt any voices were dominating. So there's a lot of work goes into that. There's a lot of weekly debriefing of facilitators. There's a lot of moving around of facilitators to different tables to ensure that this doesn't happen. So certainly the potential is there, but I think there's, you know, quite robust controls to try to limit it as much as possible.
Okay. Here's a question about the state of our democracy. And it applies, the question is focused on the Irish case, but it could equally apply to the UK or any other case. So it's Marion Coy. I think we've already had a question from her, but here goes. How can issues of legitimacy and equity be dealt with in a COVID world when one has had the kind of election outcome we have had here? And in this context, how does one support representative democracy while simultaneously utilizing deliberative processes? So I suppose it's a version of Rory O'Donnell's question, in the sense of are we somewhat guilty of missing the point about some bigger questions, and citizens' assemblies may not necessarily be the most appropriate thing right now. I guess that's sort of the background to that question. If I have a first go trying to answer it, and then I'll ask Jane and Margaret. I think in particular it's that latter part of Marion's question, simultaneously having representative and deliberative processes. There are some in the field of deliberative democracy who strongly hold to the view that representative democracy is dead and should be just debunked and got rid of. And instead we should replace representative democracy with deliberative democracy. I don't hold to that view. I think, as I was trying to suggest in my presentation, that there's a place for deliberative democracy in helping to help the process of representative democracy. It can be a bolt-on. You can bring a citizens' assembly into the process to help advise and guide the politicians. But ultimately, democracy is representative democracy. We elect our politicians for good or ill. And if they need some help, well, let's use deliberative processes to help them. So that's not most coherent answer, but perhaps, Margaret, do you want to have a go?
Well, I agree with you. I think that there are many aspects of day-to-day government that don't require these deliberative processes. I think the reason we're talking about them now is I feel we made a kind of complacent mistake insofar as ever since the Second World War, we have made very few reforms to democracy. And post-1989, we very complacently sort of assumed that, well, democracy clearly was the greatest thing ever and had clearly dominated the world. And it doesn't seem to have occurred to us that it needed any updating or modernizing. And it's hard to think of any other institution that could go on for so long without thinking it needed to update itself. And I think deliberative democracy has emerged really as a response to that complacency, which is that for any institution to remain relevant and trusted and in touch with the people it purports to serve, of course it has to change in response to the change that's happening within the constituencies and stakeholders. And I think we've seen very, very, very little of that in the post-war period. So I don't think that this is a replacement for representative democracy. I agree with you, David. But I think it's a really productive evolutionary adaptation. And I think what's really interesting about the work that you and Jane do is that you seem to me to be very pragmatic in the sense of constantly being open to different ways of doing it, of improving it, of adapting it to different circumstances and different issues. And that, I think, is really healthy, you know, that you're not rigid and ideological in your support for these mechanisms, but are seeing them as an enhancement of existing democracy, not a replacement. And I completely agree with you.
Okay, thank you. Jane?
Yeah, well, I think that's, it's, you know, absolutely the case, but it's part of the kind of question that motivated you know, the most recent experiment that we did, where, you know, people are going in time of crisis. So I think part of the question that motivates maybe Marion and Rory is this kind of, look, we're in a time of crisis, can we not just listen to the experts, please? You know, what are citizens going to bring us? Let's just listen to the experts and get this done. And, you know, that's definitely a perspective that's shared by a lot of people, and particularly by people who are feeling under threat, and who are feeling, you know, fear, which is a very natural feeling, you know, in the middle of a pandemic. But I think listening to citizens doesn't have to be an either or, it can be in addition. So the idea is that the citizens also listen to the experts. The idea is to make the expert views transparent. You know, I think it's really interesting that in New Zealand, their equivalent of NFET, that their meetings are live streamed. And everybody in New Zealand can see what they're deliberating on and where the recommendations are coming from among the experts. So it's part of that. It's about kind of increasing the transparency of the experts' recommendations, allowing people to engage with them and to ask questions of it, and in order to increase the kind of legitimacy of the process, in order to bolster the institutions. Otherwise, we're asking a lot of people to just simply go and trust the experts, and, you know, that's it. So I don't think it has to be a kind of an either or in that way.
Okay, thank you. I think we've got time for just one more question, but we'll see how we go. So there's a question here from Jane Morgan, who already had asked another question, but anyway, and it kind of takes us back to the first question, if I remember, was about Greta and whether we should engage more with younger citizens in processes of this kind. And Jane's question is this: are these principles, I presume she means deliberative principles, being integrated into curriculum in secondary schools, third level and MBAs? I think that's a really nice question. I mean, I'm just not aware of any examples of where the practice is being integrated. There's certainly, Jane and I would be teaching modules or courses in our university classes where we talk about this to our political science students, God help them. But in terms of the practice of this within the secondary or tertiary level, I think it's a really interesting idea. I don't know what you think, Margaret.
I think it's a really interesting idea, partly because I've been reflecting that a great deal in our education has left us ill prepared for this pandemic. That, and I say this in full ignorance of Irish education, so forgive me if I'm completely barking up the wrong tree. But certainly in the US and UK, which are the two places I've been educated, you know, there is a preponderance of emphasis on there being a right answer. And if you get the right answer, you're clever. And if you don't get the right answer, you're an idiot. And so we have, you know, that is a system that is designed to produce very binary thinking and that is poor at debate and exploration. And I think in an age that's characterized by uncertainty and ambiguity, that is really specifically unhelpful. And I know a number of psychologists who've been working certainly in American high schools with trying to help students learn better how to negotiate very awkward social situations or disagreements, for example, specifically in a response to bullying. You know, where bullying either invites aggression or running away. You know, how do you learn to find the middle ground there where you can have some better outcome than a fist fight or silence? And I think this is something we need to do throughout our education, which is really learn to get much better at conflict resolution, much better at listening to alternative points of view, and allowing ourselves to be open to other people's opinions and experiences that could inform our own, rather than just kind of issuing our tweet or our Facebook post and saying, that's me, I'm done, I'm out of here, take it or leave it, which is bad for social cohesion and very poor in education for intellectual development.
Thank you. Jane, any thoughts of your own on this?
No, I think it's a really good idea. And I know when we were in Penn State last year, David, John Gastel there was actually talking, they were actually trying to do something where they were actually going to bring the student body in Penn State, which is an enormous American university, together to deliberate around some of the issues. I'm not sure how far he's got with that. They were going to visit here, as you know, in March, and then they had to put it off with the lack of traveling in the pandemic. So interesting to see how they get on. But as Margaret says, I think it'd be fascinating to have this kind of, as Jane herself said, you know, listening 101, this is what it's about. We listen to other people, we try to understand where they're coming from, we increase our knowledge about their position, and we try to increase our empathy. And I think all of our societies could do better if we did more of it.
Yeah. I mean, I think also, you know, when you think of all the students who have been sent home early, who now think they want all their money back, and, you know, there is a real need to address a real problem here, which is the students feel shortchanged. But if you give all the students their money back and then you lay off their teachers, you know, then the students and the teachers are shortchanged. You know, in the meantime, there is a kind of obligation to keep an educational establishment kind of robust for the long term. You know, it might be a very interesting example of what happens when you bring students together to see the full panoply of interests and try to think about, okay, nobody's going to get everything they want. How do you resolve this? It's a it's sort of the whole post-pandemic settlement issue in a microcosm.
I could squeeze in one very last question. I only just spotted, I almost missed it. Kate Ryan asked, pre-COVID, there had been much debate about regional imbalance in Ireland, especially surrounding rural-urban divide. Is there a case to be made for citizens' assemblies at a regional level in Ireland? Well, interestingly, the government that's just gone out, the current caretaker, I suppose, government, had proposed that after the current citizens' assembly on gender equality, that they would then convene a separate citizens' assembly on the question of a Dublin mayor. The interesting dimension there was that it would be the same civil service, the same venue, everything would be the same. So it would be a citizens' assembly moving on to a different item, but it would be a new chair, and also it would have been focused only on Dublin. And I know it doesn't address your urban-rural divide at all, but at least it shows that Ireland, at least that outgoing government, was moving down that road to opening this more regional questions, and that's really kind of a nice thing to see. I think we're out of time. We've got some very nice comments from people who just said thank us, and we thank them for being such a receptive audience. 49 of you are left. I think we're in our 6th